Hello everyone and welcome to this video. I think for this one, I wanted to really go down the road of ideology and maybe reflect myself on some of my own convictions in my life. So I think if we want to talk about ideology, uh, I think for myself personally, when I think of my own ideological history, I would have to think back to when I was definitely a young college leftist, pretty run of the mill, just like everyone else, taking their young scholarly political courses. Um, so, if we wanted to kind of self examine or kind of extrapolate from that, I would say that being on the left uh, and understanding the almost, I would say, like social, the social necessity for their kind of like democratic strategy, if you will, is to definitely like create conviction through a scapegoat. In this case, the scapegoat has always been like the conservatives or the right, but I think more specifically than that, especially in current clown world setting, it's definitely comprised of a scapegoat of males and in particular white males. That's kind of the typical scapegoat you see on the right, the kind of well off, somewhat inherited skill set, even. Sometimes I think attributes, even such as like good height or a good physique, even. You could see this kind of resentment actually among leftist circles. And sometimes like they don't even get it, like it's not just like a genetic thing, and they kind of miss the concepts of work, in my opinion. But I don't want to paint with a broad brush, and I am kind of like extrapolating from myself here and reflecting. So I guess maybe we're just like owning a 19-year-old version of me. But I think it is important because it's still prevalent to this day. Like, you're always going to have this young group, and probably interwoven on the internet, that's going to be around, who's going to be alienated. And what are we going to do about that? And I don't think, in particular, liberalism or democracy actually facilitate the kind of conditions necessary to create these, what I would call, ideological scarecrows. And the way they kind of do that is, of course, the lack of like conviction and problem solving. Like, liberalism is kind of the stance of like an equilibrium, and so like you have like the so-called disbursement of like centralized powers, the media groups, the executive, Congress, all these different, the military, all these different kind of like power groups that are there's supposed to be this concept of like checks and balances, where it's actually almost heralded under like a liberal society to kind of even cohort each other or outmaneuver each other in ways for the sake of the checks and balances, to ultimately like kind of shy away from a decision, or in this case, I think solving a problem, because there's really not much cohesion or healing that I think could come from these ideological scarecrows that are meant to frenzy up, in particular, leftists. But you see it on the right too. I saw it on a kind of local level. This would be like a local example, I suppose. And we had a very, very, how would I put it, refrained demonstration during the Summer of Love in our backyard, which resulted in very minor property damage. Nonetheless, despite this very lackluster result compared to other urban settings, I'm not saying that that's not a problem, but I think it's important to point out that my local mayor was basically given exemplary power to be able to enact curfew laws that the conservatives helped craft for this Democratic mayor to be able to enact, curfew laws in the case of something similar happening to that again. Now, some people might say that that's actually like a good thing, and why would you be opposed to that? But we have to remember, in this game of politics and this very anti-authority, but ultimately authority-driven society needs to still sustain itself and try to, grow its own power and influence. And so it would be pretty concerning to think that if it was worth giving your so-called ideological enemy, and that's, I think, another problem too, is, we have these ideological battles, these ideological groups, but ultimately we do have this system set in place that really rubs one hand and the other. Just like when I warned BLM and all these other places that in Minnesota they were going to probably unbolt the funds after this is all set and done. And sure enough, you saw, like, I think, what was it, that article I saw this week about Minnesota giving the police force like another like a $5 million boost or something like that. That basically the budget like shot up because crime is so rampant there, which, I mean, that would be expected to happen. I don't need to go down why the Summer of Love was a bad thing, but yeah, I think what we're trying to get at here, though, is these scarecrows are kind of propped up. A lot of the times they're used for the consent of this democratic process of this mass population that's supposedly in charge of who gets in and who gets out. But you need consent for that kind of stuff, and so we can go through all the examples in American contemporary politics, past or present, with the NSA and concepts like that, with terrorism being used to go back through library records of your enemies and all kinds of stuff like that. So we have to be careful of these scarecrows in this in this society that we live in, but also understand, I think, that ideology doesn't have to just be this negative connotation that I think a lot of people on the sphere, and including myself, I just laid into it kind of. I still think that it's important to want to build a kind of system, though, or a system of rules or beliefs, not necessarily to push onto others in this kind of like abstract way, but I think there still is some use in some pragmatic sense to want to take these ideologies but interwoven them in a personal way to yourself in an actual like performance way. To use these kind of actual teachings, or to see below, what the leftist ultimately stands for the people of the margins, and this kind of like harm dichotomy that Jonathan Haidt and others have been pointing out lately about how sensitive they are towards this like harm and care dichotomy, which is just one pillar of morality ultimately, and they score so high that they're willing to compromise other forms of morality for that. And I think a lot of people see that on the left all the time, especially in these ideological groups where there's no sense of loyalty among the left. It's ultimately just these categories that are ever changing, and whatever the next one's going to be in the next few weeks that's most pragmatic to get at the scapegoat white male counterparts is going to be the best strategy. And so there's no real sense of loyalty. It's like nobody, I think deep down, most people on the left don't really see these groups that they're representing as an ends. Like, they would have no problem deserting if it meant bringing about that kind of like progressive vision that they have for whatever reason. But yeah, when I kind of look back at myself, I definitely see why ideology really is just about your own kind of perception, and that perception's going to come before your talking points on some forum, whether it's like the Young Turks or the Daily Wire or something like that. It's way more likely that you have some sort of experience or some sort of scapegoat that's kind of driving you along based off of your own experiences. I know personally, on a personal note, I kind of have this, resentment that I've spoken about against my own contemporaries as people of color, because I grew up in the kind of public education system that wasn't too friendly to very academically and just weird, awkward minority kids, I would say. And so, like, I kind of what really drives me is some tomb about how it's the leftists are the real racists and all this kind of stuff, or is it because of my like personal experiences with knowing living in a very, very predominantly white city and seeing it struggle and wither, and seeing my own family experiences and knowing that kind of poverty is out there and struggle is out there, and knowing there's really no hand to help you out there, unlike what a lot of people on these so-called scapegoat groups have to say. And then that's another thing too, when it comes to ideology, you have to balance how much you're willing to concede that kind of lie for your own conviction, because ultimately it's not the kind of conviction of what we think is awesome about living an experience, but it's that conviction of fuck wokeism, pretty much, right? That's like the only thing that the right has managed to rally around, is going against the social justice class and the priest class and liberal ontology and all of these kind of things we've propped up, which I'm not saying is a bad thing. It's actually, this is kind of like the point though, is like ultimately ideology is a very, very strong engine that gets a lot of people up in the morning, and you can't deny that, even though we might think that that's silly and frivolous and even petty to some degree. Sticking it to the white male counterparts is very important ultimately to the leftists, and we have to take that for what it actually is, because I don't think that is the case on the right. I think the right sees the left more as just this misguided setup of values that simply categorizes this perception of what they think is considered low class, and why that simply for the sake of being low class, that means that it must be represented, defended, almost in its own like sacred way. But that kind of totally exempts personal behavior, stuff like that. I think most people on the right would focus more on like what brings you and your friends together, and defending and sharing that loyalty, and through that kind of way, than simply like being a part of this margin and struggle together. Which isn't to say that those aren't like powerful. I'm not trying to say that either one of them don't build great relationships in their own right. Since I have said that I used to be on the left, I had great friends then too. I still have good friends that I consider on the left, but I don't see that so much on the right. In my own experience on the right, there really isn't this scapegoat presented. this concept of what we think could be and what's at the source of it, but it's never agreed upon. It's not that there isn't scapegoats. It's that it's never really put together in a way that the left can unify around the white male oppressor. Because there's all these different kinds of like variations of it. Like someone like me would go at it from more of a academic tone, kind of dry, let's be honest, takes, and trying to look at like things like Indo-Europeanism and stuff like that, while tons of people on the alt-right, it's more about the Jews, right? And so I think knowing that there's just such a interpretation of like who and what is at the issue here is one of the maybe you could say undoings about the right. I don't know if I would put it like that, but you can definitely see that these ideological suppositions, and definitely the rally around the straight white male enemy is far more powerful and prevalent on the left than the right's trying to figure out like how to defend themselves without being these hateful people. Because from my own personal experiences, I would say contemporary white Americans are the least resentful, simply because they're the middle class. Like there's really no reason to, there's no group above them that a bunch of elites would need to exploit or even like propagandize to, other than here recently. Like, don't get me wrong, I think there's a lot of funny business that happens on these nationalist fronts. The idea that there's like just some like meek grassroots movement that I think is like embroiled in American culture. I don't really believe in that kind of stuff. I think you can find very influential, important authorities and agencies and intelligence groups behind every single ideology on the map, and why they would be propped up for their own uses. Sometimes even propped up to create another scarecrow, even when it doesn't even exist, actually. But ultimately, though, we have to understand that at the end of the day, no matter what these ideologies are, whether it's Marxism or capitalism and being an anarchist or something, it really is about this so-called left and right dichotomy. But it really is about these two perceptions and two consciousnesses that are living alongside each other and literally staring at the same situations, but they come with these suppositions of different ideological scarecrows, different forms of hatred to rally around, different forms of love even. But at the end of the day, trying to find some way to actually facilitate both of them to be able to exist together is one of the most dire situations that we have, I think, going for us. And understanding that the other one trying to say, oh, they're just some mistake. I think that's really popular when I was like a leftist, was the right, and they're just going against their own values. They don't get it. They don't get what we're trying to say, and ultimately they need to be purified, and eventually they're gonna get it. Sometimes even if it needs to be tough love punishment, like almost like a corrective education, if you will. That I think you can find in an element on the left. But just like how I'm sitting here talking about what it was like to be on the left, we have to, remember that people do somewhat change, even though there's a lot of evidence that most people stick in their ways. But there is a learning experience to this kind of stuff. And while I don't think that most people sit down and they read Hayek or Sowell or something and through that way, they think that they are actually having this like great experience where they're having these red pills administered to them. Ultimately, it's because they are able to apply whatever the text may be to these real life experiences that they intuitively feel and know is true. And so I think that's what I wanted to get at for this video, is to just kind of explore that and reflect on my own ideologies and why I think that is a problem under democracy and liberalism in general that looks to exploit these differences, exploit these ideologies, because ultimately what you have to understand about ideology is this is just stuff that's written down by a bunch of nerds, and how you go about the real world and how leadership's actually going to take in a moment to grow their own influence, or just quite literally take care of their own material well-being. That's going to go way before trying to figure out some wage dispute for minimum wage hikes and how this or that. If we just tinker with these couple things, then crime's just going to drop off, and we're going to live in this Valhalla United States empire, or world. Depends on what the left kind of envisions the progress. There actually, that is kind of interesting though, and it goes back to the whole point of this, is that the left, if you actually ask them like what is that progressive vision, they almost all of them universally have a different kind of answer, different forms of anarchy, or not even being an anarchist. A lot of it's just lukewarm neoliberal takes, and understanding that the left actually only exists really to just counter the right, at least the way it's being presented to us today. It's just, why not become influential on the right and influence the people who are actually not interested so much in just opposing their opposition, but trying to actually instill the values that you think would be good on the right. Because what's the point if you're just going to oppose the right every step of the way based off of whatever they're thinking at the time? Seems like a waste to me, and ultimately the true definition of not liberating your mind. But I think that's about all. Thanks for watching, everyone. See you next time.